All right, so before we get going here, a couple things before we jump into material. So right now, that module 11 reading was going to due before we started class today. I will post the next module reading for 12 after class. That'll be due before we start class on Monday. So we'll have that module reading. If you've done all of them up to this point, we will have a module 13 reading, which I will also have get posted, and that'll be due before we start class on Tuesday. So those are the final two. All right. If you've done all of them up to this point, I dropped your lowest. So if you miss one of the final two, then that's not going to hurt you. If you've missed one up to this point, you need to make sure you get those remaining two done. Other than that, kind of those daily quizzes, always do 2 class periods after we cover the material. So kind of that quiz from yesterday due before class starts on Monday. The one we do today will be due before we start class on Tuesday. I've got those practice problems up there. There was 1 or 2 questions, had multiple parts. I changed one of, or I think I changed 2 of them. So make sure you're working with kind of the most updated. I changed the language a little bit. That would look closer to what you'd see on that module. Sorry, not module. That 5th quiz, which covers modules 9, 10, and 11. We kind of combine modules 10 and 11 there. So that'll be posted once I'm done with my second section today. So right at like 3:30, I think I have it set to be released. So you can get on, get that done any point before the end of the day on Monday. So kind of today over the weekend, or if you want to take that on Monday, it's not due before class on Monday, it's due at the end of the day. From there, module 12. Let's see if I have I have the syllabus pulled up in here. So kind of what is left remaining. So we have that 4th Canvas discussion, right? Which kind of updated. I kind of changed that. That's set to be due at the end of the day on Tuesday, I believe. We'll have a 5th Canvas discussion. I'll post that after class on Monday. That'll be due at the end of the day on Thursday, which is the day before the final. We'll also have a 6th quiz. So that 6th quiz, I will get posted on Tuesday, right? So it's going to be a little bit quicker of a turnaround. It's still due at the end of the day, that Thursday. I would start preparing for that after class Monday. I'll get up the practice problems for that. I think what I'm going to do, just because of for the sake of time, that quiz is only going to be related to module 12. Okay. So I will get some additional problems from module 13 up there so that you have more things to study. So there will be module 13 questions in that set of practice problems. But in terms of the quiz, I'm going to assign that after class Tuesday, which will just be only over module 12. So just the material we cover on Monday and Tuesday related to module 12. Okay, so that will look a little bit different. Other than that, I mentioned kind of the other changes at that top hat module reading will now be due 1 day earlier because next week, I will imagine we will cover module 12. We will finish it probably not even, I don't even know if it'll be halfway through that Tuesday class, and we'll start on module 13 that Tuesday as well. And then we'll have an additional day to kind of finish module 13. Once again, I think we might have a little bit of time on that Wednesday to even start doing some review, and that leaves that Thursday open for doing review for that final exam. Similar to the last one, even though the syllabus has this kind of tighter time block, I'm going to open this up from 9:30 to 3:30. So it'll be kind of like exam number 2. We're going to still be using that honor lock system. I will, just to make sure people have things working, if you've changed the devices you're using, I'll put up another test quiz next week that in fact I can kind of get it set up today just so you can make sure it's working for you on whatever device you're now using, if it's a different device than what you used for that second exam. Okay. Any other questions for me before we jump into material, which I believe we kind of left off right around here. Okay. All right. Okay. So we started thinking about, not fiscal policy from the government, but what the Fed can do in terms of monetary policy. Right? So we started thinking about, there's these impacts from money supply shifts or from money demand shifts. We said, what impacts money supply? These are the actions that the Fed can take. They can buy or sell securities. They can decrease or increase interest rates, discount rates on reserves, or that required reserve ratio. We then said the things that impact money demand would be changes in real GDP or income, or changes in prices. Okay. So we'll kind of keep using those and think about when these interest rates change, what's then going to happen to planned investment or investment in the physical capital. So we kind of already alluded to this with fiscal policy, but just to kind of review it a little bit here before we get kind of a little more complicated. We said when there was fiscal policy that could decrease or increase public or private savings, which influence the interest rates. So we were looking at that quantity for loanable funds market. So we said if interest rates are higher, right, it's more costly to borrow. We would see firms actually decreasing their investments into physical capital. One of those components of aggregate demand was investments in the physical capital. So if that went down, it also decreased our aggregate demand curve. Okay. Now, that was really the same thing, right, as what the Fed was doing, right, in terms of so this interest rate comes from like the overall interest rates in the economy. Usually a good marker of that we would use is like mortgage rates. I think the one slide I had a graph from Fred, and that was using mortgage rates. So when we were thinking about monetary policy, right, the Fed was impacting overall interest rates. So we had our money demand, we had our supply of money. Here was kind of the initial, or our initial interest rates. We said that if the Fed engages in these monetary policy tools, so they buy bonds or they decrease these required reserve ratios, discount rates, or interest rates on reserves. So they're not directly impacting, say, mortgage rates. They're not able to change those, but they can change the interest rates that banks have to pay as they're buying or selling these reserves. And so if they increase the money supply, even though they're not directly changing the interest rate, that change in the money supply will then kind of have that indirect effect on interest rates, lowering them. If we saw interest rates go lower, well, that means borrowing is less costly. That would do what? Increase investments, and then that would have the corresponding effects of increasing aggregate demand. So we're going to reuse this idea. It doesn't matter if we're looking at fiscal or monetary policy, both of them will influence interest rates, which then influence investment, and then that has kind of cascading effects in terms of it changes planned investment. Okay, so that's really what we're saying here. So these changes in interest rates, right, in terms of the corresponding investment now, so this isn't the money market, this is kind of what the quantity of investment, so the number of dollars spent on investing in the physical capital, there's going to be this negative relationship. And we've kind of already discussed this, we just haven't really thought about it in visual form. So as interest rates are lower, borrowing is less costly, planned investment is going to increase. Okay. So with this idea in mind, we'll start to think about how do we use monetary policy to close recession or inflationary gaps. Okay. So if I think about a scenario where I start out, right, we're kind of back to our aggregate demand, long-run aggregate supply model. If the current GDP, where short-run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand, is right here, we start out with these prices and our short-run GDP, which is lower than that long-run potential GDP, which is dictated by our long-run aggregate supply. All right, so long-run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand here. This would be our long-run GDP. GDP is currently too low. If it's too low, we call that a recession or deflationary gap. Okay. So what do we want to do to close this gap? When we're thinking about fiscal policy, we said to increase GDP, we need to increase aggregate demand from either increasing government spending or decreasing taxes. How would the Fed close this recessionary gap? Well, they want to increase GDP. So what are they going to do? Right? So we'll come back here. So we just said the fiscal policy, we want to increase aggregate demand. That's going to be the goal of the Fed as well. So how can they do that? They can't directly change it, but what they can do is say, okay, look, all we can influence is the money market, right? So here was kind of our real interest rates. We had some aggregate demand, or sorry, I shouldn't say aggregate demand, sorry. The demand for money, we had the supply for money. Here's where interest rates started out. So I think it's a little bit easier to work backwards here. So what were we wanting to do as the Fed? Well, we had this recessionary gap, which told us that short run GDP is too low compared to long run GDP. So what do we want to do? We want to increase that short run GDP with our monetary policy. Well, if I want to increase something, we call this, they'll engage in expansionary, not fiscal policy, but monetary policy, right? That's what the Fed is doing. So to increase GDP, if I'm doing this through interest rates have effects on investment. I essentially want to increase investments into physical capital, right? How do I increase investments into physical capital? Well, if we looked at that previous kind of graph, right, we said that relationship between interest rates and investment was going down. So if we want more investments, we want to decrease interest rates, make borrowing less costly. If I want to decrease interest rates as the Fed, how can I do that? Well, I need to influence the supply of money. So I want to lower interest rates. So what am I going to do? I'm going to increase the supply of money. We said, how can they do that? Well, they can inject more money into the economy by buying securities. Or remember, we said the change in the money supply was whatever that kind of initial amount banks had to loan out times 1 over that required reserve ratio. So if I want to increase that money supply, I actually want to decrease that required reserve ratio. So these are kind of the two things. We could look at the discount interest rates and reserves. They have a similar effect. So we want to increase that money supply, right? Because by increasing money supply, we will then lower interest rates, increases investments, which then increases our GDP in the short run. Or we can kind of think about if we go back to that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, we said we were starting out at a point. So this was like our long run GDP, right? We said initially short run GDP was down here. So by increasing the money supply, we decreased interest rates, increased investment in physical capital, which increases our aggregate demand curve and closes that recessionary gap. Okay. So this is where I think looking at your long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, if I have a recessionary gap, I want GDP to be higher, and then kind of working backwards to determine what the Fed would have to do in terms of the money supply is probably the easiest way to kind of answer these types of questions or to kind of solve these issues. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. Um, so I think what I just did was probably a better way of thinking about this. But, here I've got recessionary gap. We want to increase aggregate demand. So this is where working backwards. If I want to increase aggregate demand, I want to increase investments. How can I do that? Lower real interest rates. How did we do that? We increased the money supply. Okay. Or engaged in expansionary monetary policy. Now, I've kind of summarized that here, right? Well, what would be true if we instead had an inflationary gap? Everything works the exact opposite. If I have an inflationary gap, GDP is too high, I want to lower it. So how can I lower GDP? I have contractionary fiscal policy, or in the Fed's case, they're going to engage in contractionary monetary policy. So if we want to decrease real GDP, how would we do that if we had an inflationary gap? Well, I'll kind of draw this out and I'll kind of hopefully connect the dots for us. Let's see the trend. Relationship between money supply, buying and selling securities. Again. Yep, I'll actually hit on this in this next example that I gave you. So let's say we started out and I now instead, when I'm looking at that long run aggregate supply, my aggregate demand model, I've got prices, I've got aggregate demand, I've got a long run aggregate supply, and let's say my short run aggregate supply is currently right here. So that long run GDP is now less than my short run GDP. And we kind of even think about what were my initial price levels right here. Okay. So if we have an inflationary gap, and how do we know that? Well, if GDP in the short run is too high, right? We call that an inflationary gap. So once again, kind of working backwards, if I want to close this gap, I actually want to decrease GDP in the short run. How can I do that? Well, I can't influence consumption, net exports directly, or I'm not using government spending. I'm not using fiscal policy. So I would actually there want to decrease investment in the fiscal capital. How would I do that? I increase real interest rates. And then we'll kind of look at the model. Well, how do I increase real interest rates? So this kind of goes to the question that you had. So if I'm thinking about the money market, I've got my quantity of money, got my demand for money, I've got my supply. Here we kind of had real interest rates. So interest rates start out here. I want to increase them, right? So what I actually want to do as the Fed is decrease that supply of money. That would then increase my real interest rates. If I then increase real interest rates, I decrease investments, I would actually shift the aggregate demand curve down. And now we end up with short run GDP is exactly the same as long run GDP. I've closed that inflationary gap. Now, how can I decrease the money supply? Well, kind of going back, one of the ways we had was how do I change the money supply with my required reserve ratio? Well, it's whatever that initial amount I have to loan out is times 1 over that required reserve ratio. So if I want to decrease the money supply, I force banks to hold on to more of those initial investments, which means that same deposit into the bank actually has a smaller impact on money supply. Now, it's still going to increase money supply, but I'm just thinking about here, what's the effect of increasing that required reserve ratio? It decreases the effect of that initial investment on the money supply. So that change is getting smaller, right? It's not the actual level. It's just that that change in money supply is going to go down. Okay? Now, what's the other thing that we could do? So this is the best way, most technical way to think about it, but I was kind of describing this last class. I think this is a good way to kind of help solidify this in your mind. If I want there to be less money out there, right, I want to decrease my money supply. If the Fed buys things from banks, it's giving them money. That's going to be increasing the money supply. If they sell them, right, that means banks are giving them money. So they're taking money out of the economy. So when we sell these securities, we're kind of taking money away or decreasing that money supply. Okay. Questions on this idea before we continue? That hopefully answer your question. Okay. So there we go. So that's our kind of monetary policy reactions to both inflation and deflationary gaps, right? So we just kind of worked through that. We're now going to go to a little bit more complicated situations. Okay. So here we're going to combine some of the things we talked about in module 10 with, or sorry, module 9 with module 11. So let's say we have a simultaneous shift in everything, right? Short run supply, long run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. If that aggregate demand increase is less than the long run aggregate supply increase, we said we're going to end up with a recessionary gap. So I'll draw this out for us here in a second, but that's going to be kind of the resulting impact. So if we had a recessionary gap, what did we do? Well, we wanted to increase GDP. So we just kind of worked through some examples where we said, if I wasn't using monetary policy, go back to module 9, how do I increase GDP? I increase the aggregate demand. I can do that by either spending more money, right, increasing government spending, or I give more money to consumers to buy things, so I would decrease taxes. So that was kind of our fiscal policy, was we want to increase aggregate demand through government spending or taxes. That was our expansionary fiscal policy. We want to increase GDP. If I'm thinking about monetary policy, we just said, well, what would have that same effect? How could I increase aggregate demand there? Well, we walked through the steps. We said we need to increase investments. We do that by decreasing interest rates, which then, how do I decrease interest rates? I was going to increase the money supply. So different tools to get at the same outcome, right? We want to close these gaps. We can use either fiscal or recessionary, or sorry, fiscal or monetary policy, right, to engage in this expansionary, either expansionary fiscal or monetary policy there. And then what if instead, you know, I could work through a slightly more complicated model in terms of the quiz or the exam. I said to make this a little bit easier to think about, and it really gets at the same concept. Let's assume that even when we have these long run aggregate supply shifts, I'm going to give you the assumption that short run aggregate supply doesn't change. So I'll actually draw this out to kind of show you like there is no change in short run aggregate supply. In theory, there still could be. It's just that if it doesn't update automatically, right, it doesn't shift by as much as that long run aggregate supply, we're going to still end up with um, possibly a recessionary gap, right? Now I'll kind of simplify this and tell you that there is no shift in short run aggregate supply, only a shift in long run aggregate supply. But in practice, they can both shift at the same time. And it would just be that initially that long run supply updates more than that short run supply. You can kind of notice here, like really large change in long run, really small change in short run. So if that's the case, right, well, we would still end up with on our old, excuse me, so we think about our old demand curve, right? If long run aggregate supply increases, well, at the same time, we increase aggregate demand, right? We engage in expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. Well, even with that short run supply shift, the new GDP is right here. It's now lower than that long run GDP. So we actually have kind of a recessionary gap, even if initially we started out with no gap at all. Okay? So I'll kind of walk through what this might look like and give you some slightly different examples. But for what I give you on the quiz or exam, I'm going to just kind of shut down that supply curve shift. So I'll kind of show you what this would look like. Right? And then if we still have a recessionary gap, we need to increase aggregate demand by even more. So let's kind of take a look at what this might look like. Okay. What do I say here? So let's say we start out with a scenario. I'm going to do something similar to what we just had in the slides, but I'm going to talk through it a little bit more. Right? So let's say we're here and I've got prices. So what do I want? I want to have, I just worked so expansionary. So let's say we had initially long run aggregate supply. Here's our aggregate demand. And what do I want to, let me think what I want to show you first. So let's do, here's our initial short run aggregate supply. So initially we have, here's our original short run GDP and our long run GDP. Okay? So GDP is too low. So we have a recessionary gap. Right? So what's one thing that we could do, right? So if I want to increase GDP, we said we want to engage in expansionary monetary policy. So if we want to increase GDP, we said, how could we do that? We want to increase investments. We do so by decreasing interest rates. What caused decrease in interest rates? Increases in that money supply. So if we close that gap, right, through monetary policy, right, this would be kind of a very basic model, right? Now, if we complicate this with, even though we had this expansionary fiscal policy to close that gap, what if at the same time we saw long run aggregate supply also increase? Okay. Well, if long run aggregate supply increases, we now close the old gap, but our new kind of long run GDP is out here. We only pushed short run GDP to that old level that would have closed the gap. So what do we still have? We would still have kind of this recessionary gap. So even if we adjust this monetary policy to close old gaps, if there is then a simultaneous shift in long run aggregate supply, we should have, increased the money supply by even more, right? In fact, we would actually want, I didn't even almost leave ourselves enough room. So let's say like, there's my short run aggregate supply curve. I actually would have wanted to shift it all the way out here to close that gap, right? That was then, to close that gap that was created by that long run aggregate supply shift. So it's almost like as the Fed, I have to anticipate that even though I'm engaging in expansionary monetary policy, that as I'm doing that, there may be other simultaneous shifts. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So one thing I wanted to point out here is regardless, right? So let's think about if I didn't have that long run aggregate supply simultaneous shift, what did my monetary policy do? Well, it caused GDP to go up in the short run, but it also caused, from the initial point, prices to increase. Right? And then if there was this response from long run aggregate supply, if I close that gap by engaging in even more expansionary monetary policy, I've increased prices by even more. So the cost of this expansionary monetary policy to close these recessionary gaps, yes, I can close the gap, but it comes at a cost of what? Similar to fiscal policy, I've caused prices to increase or I've caused inflation. Right? And just as kind of tying this into things we've already talked about, remember, we said this quantity theory of money said changes in the money supply times changes in the velocity of money was equal to changes in prices. And I think here I didn't write GDP. I think I was using Y, but this is really changes in GDP. Okay? So anytime that the Fed increases the money supply, that's going to be matched by an increase in prices. That's exactly what our model is telling us. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Okay. Let me think here. So we'll work through the opposite, and I'll throw in something that's a little bit more complicated. Okay. So let's assume that we go back and we look at this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And now I want to start out, and let's say, so I want to do here. So here's my aggregate demand. Here's my long run aggregate supply. And let's just assume we started out at a point where long and short run GDP are initially the same. Okay. If there is something other than the government actions that causes aggregate demand to shift, right? So let's say, just for an example, since we're going to focus on monetary policy, let's say that the government engages in fiscal policy. So I'm going to throw a lot of things in here at once, but if they engage in fiscal policy such that they decrease taxes, right, what impact would that have? So I'm going to draw this relatively small. So here we have kind of this decrease in taxes from fiscal policy would increase our aggregate demand, right? So initially, what impact would that have? Well, it would have caused short-run GDP to go up. So there we would have had an inflationary gap, right? Excuse me. In which case we can walk through what monetary policy should be. So if that was like the only thing that happened when there was this fiscal policy, what should the monetary policy response be? Well, we know that if the government decreases taxes, our kind of new short-run GDP would be higher. If it's too high, we had this inflationary gap. We said, how do we close that gap? Well, we want to decrease GDP back to those old long-run levels. If I want to decrease aggregate demand, we said, what should we do? So here, I think this is where we're working backwards, right? We want to decrease aggregate demand. How can we do that through monetary policy? We would decrease investments into physical capital by increasing our real interest rates. If we go back, how do we increase real interest rates? Well, there we would actually want to cause a supply decrease. So to raise interest rates, we want to decrease the supply of money. Okay. How can we do that? Well, we could sell securities, right? Take money away, or we could increase that required reserve ratio, taking money away from the banks in terms of how much money they could then loan out. Okay. So I'm going to throw in one more thing to kind of complicate this a little bit. So before I do, are there any questions there? Right. This is kind of looking at, I could actually combine monetary and fiscal policy, right? So if the government decreases taxes, they might be creating an inflationary gap. So if they're talking to the Fed at all, they might be like, hey, we're going to decrease taxes, but we don't want there to be any inflation or deflationary gap. And you can think about also, why is this called an inflationary gap? Remember, what happens to kind of short run prices? They're now higher than what we want, right? So if we've decreased taxes, what can the Fed do to kind of counteract that? Well, it can decrease the money supply, which would then decrease aggregate demand so that we end up back at where short run and long run GDP are the same. So if the government can do these actions simultaneously, right, we could have different combinations, of fiscal and monetary policy that actually result in no inflation or deflationary gap. Now, if one of those effects is larger, right, then all bets are off, right? So for example, if when I engaged in this contractionary monetary policy, I was trying to reduce GDP, let's say that that change in fiscal policy was greater than the change from monetary policy. Well, there, my new short-run GDP is still going to be a little bit too high, right? So the relative size of these changes, it's kind of like our third scenario, will matter. If we see them engage in both fiscal and monetary policy at the same time, the total effect in terms of whether or not we're going to see that inflationary gap closed or not it matters what the relative size of those changes are. If the fiscal policy, so the way that I kind of drew this out was if that the effects from that fiscal policy, decrease in taxes, if it was larger than the effects of our monetary policy, which was decreasing the money supply, then we would still have some inflationary gap existing. Now, we've closed it a little bit, right? But it still exists. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay, so we can then combine that, going even one step further, right? So let's say that we don't have any fiscal policy from the government, but we start out with this scenario, and it'll look very similar. We're just going to talk through different things that could change, right? So initially I have my aggregate demand, and here, what do I want? Yeah, so let's do my long run aggregate supply. Initially, price levels are here, and initially my long run and short run aggregate supply, sorry, and my long run and short run GDP are exactly the same. Okay. So let's say there's a simultaneous shift. Okay. So I'm going to have two things that are changing here. The first thing that I'm going to have changing is, let's say that there's just an increase in consumption. Okay. So if I have this increase in consumption, that's going to increase my aggregate demand. If I'm increasing my aggregate demand, what impacts is this going to have? Well, initially it's going to increase my short run GDP, right? But let's say I have a simultaneous shift. Let's say at the same time, I have long run aggregate supply going up. So I'll kind of try to work through one that's a little bit different than what we just did. So let's say one of those factors of pull increases. And maybe this productivity goes up, human capital investments in education goes up. If that effect is larger than that effect that consumption increases have, maybe my new long run aggregate supply is out here. Right, so we had kind of these simultaneous shifts. We looked at this with fiscal policy, where we had a change in aggregate demand and a change in long run aggregate supply. If that change in long run aggregate supply is greater, well then yes, the consumption increase would increase GDP, but that long run aggregate supply is also going to change GDP. Right? But if this effect is larger, my long run GDP is now going to be greater than my short run GDP. So what do we now have existing? Well, if GDP is too low, we've got a recessionary gap. So that's kind of like the first part of our, maybe this would be a problem. So I think in the slides we'll look at here in a second, slide 25. Excuse me. What we're going to see is, because that shift in long run aggregate supply, what did I want here? Oh, I did the reverse of what the slides have. That's okay. We can work through more examples. I think we'll have plenty of time today. So that long run aggregate supply shift was larger, which caused our long run GDP to go up by even more than short run. We have a recessionary gap. That's like the first part. Now in module 9, I then asked you, okay, now that we know we have a recessionary gap, what would the fiscal policy response be? Well, if I was using fiscal policy, I now want to increase GDP by even more, right? How could I do that? Well, if I was using fiscal policy, how did we increase aggregate demand? We said we could increase government spending, or we could decrease taxes. Right? Now, if instead I'm wanting to use monetary policy, I still want to increase aggregate demand, but the Fed can't change government spending or taxes, right? What they can change is the money supply. Now, once again, you can always work through these steps. I mean, if you have it written down, you could kind of make this connection and skip the steps. So I'll kind of show you what the end result would be, right? But if we want to increase aggregate demand, right, we actually want to, I think I had it here, like money supply, however we want to kind of notate this. So that's like the end result. But how does the Fed do that? Well, in order to increase aggregate demand, they need to increase investments. They then, in order to do that, need to decrease real interest rates, which we said, how do they do that? They would increase the money supply. So kind of where that comes from is in our money market, we had our demand for money. We had this supply of money, our initial equilibrium interest rate. By increasing money supply, we decreased real interest rates, which caused investments to go up, which then caused aggregate demand to increase. So in response to this recessionary gap, we have the monetary policy is going to increase aggregate demand even more, right? Until we get to that point where after the monetary policy, short and long run GDP are exactly the same. Okay. So there could be simultaneous shifts independent of the government, right? I had consumption and factors of pull changing here. The relative size of those changes impacts whether or not we'd see a recession or inflationary gap. And then depending on what type of gap we see, we've already talked about what the fiscal policy response should be. We're now thinking about what would the monetary policy have to be. Okay. Any questions there before we kind of keep moving here? Okay, let me see what we're at in slides, just in terms of time. Another 30 minutes. Okay. Um, so there's no, okay, I got a question here. Hold on. I want to make sure we kind of go slow. So the Fed controls the minds. So the Fed controls monetary policy. You can think about like politicians or the president, people making these decisions, they influence fiscal policy, right? They create new government programs. Excuse me, they write new taxes into law, right? So you can think about like the government overall is impacting and fiscal policy. The Fed is kind of like this arm of the government that, remember, it's not they're appointed individuals. So they're somewhat independent of the government, but they're also like a part of it, right? So ideally, politicians are talking with the members of the Fed, or at least they're trying to coordinate their actions so that they don't have like counteracting um, policies, right? They should both be either engaging in contraction or expansionary policies. But maybe, like in my earlier example, maybe if they're doing it simultaneously, where did I have that at? I don't know. I don't know where I put it. What did I have? Oh, I had here, right? We could kind of see like fiscal and monetary policy. If they like counteracted each other, we can still end up at the same point where we have no gap. Yeah, but the Fed is only changing monetary policy. We can think about it like as politicians, governors, senators, right? They're creating these new programs that increase government spending, eliminating programs, so decrease government spending, etc. Okay. Does that kind of get that question, hopefully? Okay. So the next thing I want to kind of talk through is, so we did a response to an inflationary gap. Let's think about if we had something that caused a deflationary gap. So I'll do something that's a little bit trickier. We then have one more thing we want to talk about before we get to kind of that daily quiz. So here, what if instead, and a lot of the times if we're looking at these practice problems and the quiz and eventually the exam, let's say that we have this model where we're starting out and We start out with absolutely no gap, okay? Let's say we have another simultaneous shift, and now I have an increase in long run aggregate supply. So maybe one of these factors of pull is increasing. Okay. So if that's the case, here's my new long run aggregate supply. My new long run GDP is going to be up here, right? But aggregate demand hasn't changed. And I said, I'll give you this simplifying assumption that we assume short run aggregate supply hasn't changed either. Now, in reality, it probably does update a little bit, but not as much as long run aggregate supply. But I'll shut that down just to make these, I think, a little bit easier to kind of go through and kind of solve. So our short run GDP, oh, here, I'll keep this black here, isn't impacted by that change in long run aggregate supply, right? So now our short run GDP is too low, right? Now we said there, okay, what if aggregate demand increases, right? That's going to kind of cause our short run GDP to go up. But what if instead I had something that decreased my aggregate demand? Okay. So if I had something that decreased aggregate demand, and here we'll end up seeing it doesn't matter what the relative size is. So let's say I had, I don't know, net exports going down, right? So this shift in pull increased long run aggregate supply, shift in net exports, that would actually decrease my aggregate demand. So even, I'll kind of do two scenarios here. Even if that decrease is smaller than the impacts that that change in pull had, notice what happens, right? Well, where is my new short run GDP? It's going to be lower, right? So now, if we had these simultaneous shifts, well, the long run aggregate supply increases my potential or long run GDP. My short run GDP is even lower. What do I now have? A recessionary gap, like with certainty, right? And the reason why is because regardless of the size of that shift, let's think about another scenario. Let's say net exports went down by a lot more than that change that the factor of pull caused. Well, now maybe my new aggregate demand is down here, in which case my short run GDP is even lower. In either scenario, it's too low. I still would have a recessionary gap. So this combination of aggregate demand shifts and long run aggregate supply shifts, if they're working in opposite directions, we always know what's going to happen. In my earlier example, when they work in the same direction, there the relative size of those changes matters. Okay. So if I gave you this problem, it's actually a little bit easier because we know that both of these shifts are going to result in short run GDP going lower, long run GDP going higher. So if long run GDP is greater than short run, we know we're going to have this recessionary gap. So what should that response to a recessionary gap be? Well, we said if there's a recessionary gap, what do we actually want to do? We want to increase aggregate demand to get to this long run level. If I want to increase aggregate demand through monetary policy, well, first of all, if I'm increasing, it would be expansionary. How do I do that? Well, I increase investments into physical capital. I do that by lowering real interest rates. And we said, how do we lower real interest rates? Well, if we go back to our money market, got the quantity of money and real interest rates. We had our demand for money. We had our supply of money. How did we decrease real interest rates? We actually wanted to increase our money supply. Decreasing interest rates would then increase investments, which would then increase our aggregate demand, closing that recessionary gap. Right? So how do we lower interest rates? We increase the supply of money. How can we do that? Through monetary policy, buying bonds or securities, putting more money out into the economy, or lowering that required reserve ratio, making every initial deposit into the bank have an even larger effect on the money supply, right? It kind of increased that multiplier. Okay. So this is like the most complex, complicated questions I would ask you, where we have kind of simultaneous shifts in aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. We then have to determine what the resulting gap would be, and then what is the response in monetary policy going to be to that. Okay. All right. So if there's both monetary, we should be totally relevant. Yeah, so like I think when I worked through that earlier example, if it was that aggregate demand was being shifted by fiscal policy, in order to know the impacts, if they are opposites, if they're both expansionary fiscal policy and monetary policy, we know that GDP is going to go up. If they're both contractionary, we know it's going to go down. If they ever work in opposite directions, right? Expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary monetary policy, well, there we have to know which one is larger. And instead of going through all the steps there, if you want to think about maybe a good way to shorthand this is think about the words, right? So let's say I had fiscal policy and I'm engaging in expansionary fiscal policy. Well, once again, expansion, what is that doing to short run GDP? Causing it to go up. If at the same time, the Fed is engaging in contractionary fiscal policy, well, contraction, we're pulling that GDP down. Well, if short run GDP is going up, right, we would see that like we're closing the gap, right? So it depends on which of these is larger. Like let's say we had a recessionary gap initially. If that fiscal policy change is greater than our monetary policy change, well, what effect is going to win out here? GDP, this total effect, try to use colors here to kind of, so our total effect would be, well, which one of these is going to dominate that fiscal policy change? So there we would see short run GDP is going up, or the combination of these two increasing GDP would hopefully be closing a recessionary gap. If the opposite was true, all right, so let's say we had this fiscal policy impact was less than our monetary policy impact. Well, there, what would the total effect be? Well, which one is larger? The monetary policy that's reducing GDP. So there, that total effect would be we see short run GDP actually go down. So that's where the relative size matters. If we are seeing the government and the Fed engage in opposite types of policy, contraction, expansionary, right? They're working against each other. What the resulting change in short run GDP will be depends on which of those is larger. And we could draw this out and do like the relative size of the shifts to kind of reflect, do a larger shift in the fiscal policy than the monetary policy. But this would be kind of a shorthand way, I think, to think about it. Maybe it's a little bit easier to see that here. Any other questions on that? Okay. So we'll work through one more thing, and I think we'll take a look at the daily quiz to kind of close us out here. So let's assume that we're just now going to focus on monetary policy. Okay. So let's say we've got real GDP and here's kind of like our initial point. I'll start out with an example, and if we have time, we'll do another one. But let's assume that we start out with no gap, right? So short run and long run GDP start out exactly the same. If, let's just assume that for whatever reason, even though there is no gap, let's say that the Fed engages in expansionary monetary policy. Right? So if it's expansionary, first of all, you don't even have to go through all the steps if you don't want to. a question could ask you about these steps, but initially, okay, if it's expansionary, that means I want to increase GDP. We're going to see there's a resulting increase in aggregate demand from this policy. How would they increase aggregate demand? Well, monetary policy impacts investments into physical capital, so we would want to increase those investments. When will firms choose to do that? When interest rates are what? Well, if it's less costly, that would mean interest rates are lower. How do we cause interest rates to be lower? We said we increase that money supply. Okay. So by increasing the money supply, we lowered real interest rates, increase investments, and cause aggregate demand to go up. Okay. Now, this initial response is going to be that short run GDP is now higher. Right. So what have we actually created? Well, we went from no gap to we now have GDP is too high, so we have an inflationary gap. Okay. Now, another way we could think about this is if I didn't start out with no gap, what would I actually want to use expansionary policy to solve? Well, if I want GDP to be higher, that would be a good response if there was a recessionary gap. But with a simplifying assumption, we start out with no gap, the monetary policy would actually then increase GDP, causing there now to go from no gap to have an inflationary gap. Well, just like with fiscal policy, we talked about with fiscal policy, there could be secondary effects of changes in the loanable funds market, changes in interest rates, overall changes in investment. And we also talked about maybe if we had changes in government spending that changed the amount of money that was out there available. And we said it's invested into factors of pull. We could then kind of have this secondary effect of a shift in long-run aggregate supply. With monetary policy, the secondary effect that we're going to focus on is the following. So what happened when we engaged in this expansionary fiscal policy? We actually caused prices in the short run to go up. Okay. If prices are higher, the same amount of dollars in our pocket, the value of each dollar, right? We can't buy as much as before. So you can think about this as when prices go up, the value of the dollar decreases. Okay. So if the value of the dollar decreases, right, are we going to want, what are we going to see? Well, if our money is worth less, we're not going to be kind of importing as much, right? So if we think about net exports, what would the secondary effect be? Well, that's exports minus imports. If the value of our currency, because this caused prices to be higher, decreased the value of our currency, we're not going to be importing as much as before. So if we subtract a smaller value, net exports is going to increase. So the secondary effect of this monetary policy, initially, we get this nice increase in aggregate demand. If net exports are going up, what's that going to do? It's going to cause aggregate demand to go up by even more. So this secondary effect, that response from net exports, is going to cause GDP to go up by an even larger amount. So if we factor in this secondary effect, we not only created an inflationary gap through our monetary policy, the secondary effect made that that inflationary gap even larger. So with monetary policy, because we have this secondary effect of that it changes the value of the dollar, which then changes net exports, it's actually going to lead to the effects of that monetary policy being even larger than if we didn't have that secondary effect, right? And then the exact opposite would hold if we had contractionary monetary policy, right? We would decrease the aggregate demand. The response by net exports would decrease it even more. So we talked about the secondary effects with fiscal policy. Here's the only kind of secondary impact we're going to focus on with monetary policy. I might have said that twice. We already talked about secondary effects with fiscal policy. Now we're talking about the secondary effect that is related to monetary policy. Okay. Okay. So that's, I think, kind of working through the visual of what lines up with this slide, kind of thinking about that secondary or the additional effects that monetary policy can have. So just to get more practice with this here today. Oh, make sure I publish that before we kind of dive into it. Yeah, it's published. Okay. So we'll go here, think about two different questions. I think the first one will be a little bit easier. So let's kind of walk through these. So let's say we start out from a point where there's no gap that exists. Right? We then think about if the government increases spending, in the short run, what's going to happen? Are we going to see an inflation or deflationary gap? And then in response to that, what should the Fed do? And if these policies are engaged at the same time, what's going to happen to short run GDP? Okay. So once again, I'm kind of giving this simplifying assumption that the initial thing, yeah, so the only secondary impact we're focusing on for monetary policy is just going to be the effects on net exports. We could, there, I mean, there's secondary, there's tertiary, like we could go down the road for a while, but that's the only thing we're going to kind of focus on in terms of a secondary effect for monetary policy. So for this problem, here's our original aggregate demand. We're going to start out with a scenario where long-run GDP and short-run GDP are exactly the same. There's no gap. If the government increases spending, what impact is that going to have? Well, that's fiscal policy. So let's say that we have government spending increase. What's that going to do to our short-run GDP? Increase it, doesn't impact long run, right? Now, there could be a secondary effect. I won't combine that with monetary policy here. So we're just thinking about the initial effect of that fiscal policy, right? So the one we were thinking about here was an increase in government spending. Technically, this also could have been a decrease in taxes. So if that's what we see, what do we now have? Well, GDP in the short run is now greater than our long run GDP. So what type of gap do we have? GDP is too high, right? So we've got this inflationary gap. Okay. So that's kind of the first part. We have an inflationary gap. In order to close this gap, what should the Fed do? Well, this is where we can kind of work backwards, right? So if we're thinking about our money market, and here's where you don't have to work backwards. I just think it's a lot easier. So if we had our demand for money and we had our supply of money, our initial interest rates are right here. Well, it kind of becomes a little bit harder to think about what I need to do to get to this end result. Now, if it helps, right, when we want to increase aggregate demand with monetary policy, it'll always be that I want to increase that money supply, right? Now, the reason why, right, is because what did I actually want? Well, in order to increase aggregate demand, I needed to increase investments. I did that by lowering interest rates. How did we lower interest rates? We increased that money supply. So we can see that down here. And here I'll kind of do this in a different color because we'll then think about what the impacts would be on our long run aggregate supply aggregate demand model. So if I increase money supply, so if you're trusting me here for a second, that decreased real interest rates, which would then increase investments, right? Makes borrowing less costly. If investments go up, that was one of the components of aggregate demand. Excuse me. Oh, sorry, I worked in the reverse here. I don't want to increase it. Hold on. So sorry, I got ahead of myself. If I did do this, what am I doing? I'm increasing aggregate demand even more. So this would be like, how would we get the same effect? If that government spending causes an inflationary gap, what do I actually want to do? I want to reduce GDP. So we would go through the exact same thought process, but we would do the exact opposite, right? So we'll kind of do this in green here. This is going to be what we actually want, right? So I do the exact opposite. I increase the money supply. Sorry, I decrease the money supply. that causes my real interest rates to go up, which causes investment to go down, which then decreases my aggregate demand. So it starts to shift my aggregate demand curve back to that long run outcome. Now, so in order to do this, we want to, sorry, where am I at here? We want to reduce the money supply. How can we do that? Well, we can either sell US securities. That's not one of our options. If we increase the required reserve ratio, that means the amount of loanable funds they have to keep more of them in the banks. That would cause a decrease in our money supply. So that should be our answer. But then why would decreasing the discount rate not work? Well, if I decrease the discount rate there, kind of thinking about this as like when the banks are taking out these loans, they're paying a lower amount, they have more money available, that would actually be increasing the money supply as well. So the only thing that decreases our money supply there would be if we increase that required reserve ratio. Now, if we have these simultaneous policies, both that change in government spending or, sorry, at the same time, a change in the money supply, well, what's going to happen? Well, if it decreased aggregate demand here, I still have GDP that is too high. However, if that change caused by monetary policy is even larger than that change caused by fiscal policy, I could now end up in a scenario where I've actually driven the GDP to be too low. So if I have these things happening at the same time, right, expansionary fiscal policy, contractionary monetary policy, the answer is going to be, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen to my new short-run GDP. Could be right here, could be down here. Okay. All right. So the second one, we've got like 3 minutes left in terms of how I set this. Oh, this is going to be a more complicated one. I think we have enough time to work through it. But I want to give the answers here. So I had what? Initial short run, same. Government decreases taxes. I'll just give you the answers here and we'll kind of work through it. So for problem 2, we have contractionary policy decreases prices, decreases net exports, and causes that real GDP change to be even larger. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen with you. That would be helpful. So to get that kind of response in before the time's up, here's kind of the answers to question 2. So in the remaining 7 minutes, we'll kind of, I'll show you why those are the correct answers. Okay. So this is a very complicated question. This is one of the harder questions you will see on the quiz and on the exam. So here I've got changes in taxes, right? Well, at the same time, I'm seeing a change in my labor supply. Now, I don't tell you which of those is larger, but we're going to reuse something that we talked about in Module 9. Okay. So we said if we started out from a point and there's no gap, right? So we kind of start out here. This was like our initial GDP in both the long and the short run. If the government decreases taxes, what is the initial impact of that going to be? Well, if they decrease taxes, that should increase our aggregate demand. Right? However, so what would this do? This would increase our short-run GDP. So before I draw that in here, right, that's our kind of first effect. What would the secondary effect be? Well, we said when taxes go down, if this is an income tax, think about this as, well, it's now working the same number of hours. I have a larger amount of income, right? So I can then I'd be willing to supply more of my labor. So we said this decrease in taxes, kind of the secondary effect is that it increases labor supply, which was one of those factors of pull. So that increased our long run aggregate supply curve. We're told here that long run aggregate supply shift is less than the effect that came from these taxes. So I'll kind of draw this in to kind of reflect that. But if you think about what would the long run aggregate supply increasing do? Well, it's actually going to cause my long run GDP to go up. So we'll draw in what we were told was that aggregate demand shift was much larger than our long run aggregate supply shift. Now, here once again, I would give you in the problem if we weren't working through it together. Let's assume that short run aggregate supply doesn't change at all. Well, now my new long run GDP is right here, but my short run GDP is here. So kind of what has been created? Well, if GDP is too high, I've got what type of a gap? Inflationary. If I have an inflationary gap, what do I want to do as the Fed? If I'm responding to this, well, I actually want to decrease that short run GDP. If I decrease that short run GDP, how can I do that? Well, we said essentially we want to decrease aggregate demand. We do that by decreasing investments. That's going to be a result of increasing interest rates. And how do we increase interest rates? We actually decrease that money supply. Okay. So if there's an inflation, the Fed engages in contractionary fiscal policy, right? That's going to cause aggregate demand to go down, right? Which should push that short run GDP to be even lower. Right? Now, in this example, they overshot it, right? They went too far, right, closing that inflationary gap, and that they've now created an recessionary gap. Now, even if they didn't, right? So let's say they got the amount right and they got this inflationary gap closed. Right? If we then have a secondary effect, which is that, okay, what did this do, right? When I engage in this monetary policy, relative to without it, what have I done to prices? Well, that monetary policy actually lowered prices. If prices are lower, right? Excuse me, we would see the value of the dollar increase. If the value of the dollar increases, we're going to import more. So here, when prices go down, increases the value of the dollar, which is going to increase imports. But remember, net exports is exports minus imports. If this gets larger, net exports is going to go down. So the secondary effect of that monetary policy, I'm going to draw this very extreme, but it's going to push aggregate demand down even more. So that's why the initial effects of that monetary policy, yes, it's decreasing GDP, but the secondary effect from that exports, it's going to decrease GDP by even more than the initial kind of plan that the Fed had, right? So that's why kind of that last part was that it's going to increase the change caused or the decrease in real GDP will be even larger if we factor in this secondary impact it's going to have on net exports. So once again, this is like every concept we've talked about, like all into one, right? We had government fiscal policy changing. We had simultaneous shifts, like that secondary effect. We had to determine if we had an inflationary deflationary gap, what should the Fed's response be to that? And then the effects of their response will be amplified by that secondary effect from monetary policy, which is that we see that change be even larger. So I would likely not throw all of these things at you at once. I would kind of break these down into different components, but this really takes everything we talked about from modules 9 and 11 and like puts them into just one complex model. So that takes us to the end. So I'm going to stop the